English translation 544th contact Saturday, the 1st of September 2012, 14:14 hours.
But you said you would not come here until 14:45 HRS. However, it is only 14:14 hours now.
Yes, but I have been here all the time since we discontinued the correction work, because Bernadette was indisposed, and we could not carry on the work. Besides, we will be absent from tomorrow until the middle or end of November. Hence, we will not return to your place until the middle of November or the beginning of December. But today we have a lot of time for our conversation, because the correction work no longer needs to be done.
Nothing that can be done about it. But nice we have time because it allows me to touch on a lot of things before there is a transmission break afterwards. Who will be here for Injana and Florena?
In fact, a change is not feasible. Those who will be taking over the duties of Florena and Injana are not known to you.
No big deal. They may also come here if they want to. But look here. These are some sample pages of the photo book that Piero is producing. He gave them to me so that you would be able to look at them and assess them. Here, please.
Whether you will be visited, that will turn out, but I can promise nothing. Thank you.
Ta looks at the sample pages.
I find the arrangement all right, but regarding the colors I have difficulties, because they should be better. And look here, at the magnification in the picture, 133:1 does not see the flying apparatus of Ascot, which is why it should be somewhat emphasized. The same is applicable to the magnification of picture 134. Probably nothing can be changed for the better with the out-of-focus pictures. Also, the fact that the pictures in general appear inept in terms of their photographic technique is particularly striking. As to what still has to be said about the scope of the pictures in the book, all important pictures of the beam ships, their traces, as well as, however, also important pictures of persons of the core group and of special visitors should be contained in it. The posters, too, should be inserted and special reports, as for example from the Pergler. However, what I want to say about these sample pages, extend my special thanks to Piero for his efforts, which he musters to produce this book.
I will do so. Regarding the colors, Piero said that they will still improve. And the range of pictures as well as the posters will be taken into account. Unfortunately, there is nothing that can be changed about the photo footage because I was never a trained or hobby photographer. When I took the first photos of the beam ships, I had no experience yet, and also did not know what I had to pay attention to when photographing. Only in the course of time did it turn out that the photos became a little better. However, I never reached a perfection because I lacked the necessary training and practice for it. For perfect shots, I would probably have needed a photographic training course, something I have never been interested in to this day. Back then, when Simyase called me and explained to me that I shall prepare myself for the first contact with her and also obtain a photo camera, I bought one from my brother Gottlieb due to lack of a good camera of my own, namely the Olympus 35 ECR, which did not allow for any settings to be made and whose lens was furthermore clamped, as you know.
This is known to me. Though my remark that the photographic technique of the pictures appears to be clumsy, this was not meant to be a reproach, because I know that you had no practice concerning photographing and that you were also never really interested in it. But only practice this activity because you were encouraged to do so by my daughter Simyase.
Despite the many photos I was allowed to take, I have remained a photographic failure and thus a layman on this subject. Even today, I am not able to get enthusiastic about photography.
Which is not necessary either, because the necessary photographic proofs that you were supposed to produce in relation to our flying apparatuses, these indeed came about through your efforts. More is and was not necessary, and no Earth humans have made better pictures of our flying apparatuses. Therefore, no better ones exist than yours. Your photographic ineptitude carries no weight in this, as you tend to put it, and moreover, the pictures got better over time, which is actually why also some very good photo shots exist.
Yes, in the course of time I managed a few of them a bit better, but also for these photos one cannot speak of perfection. Furthermore, it must be said that especially these genuine photos of evidence have triggered the biggest worldwide UFO controversy ever, since there has been talk of UFOs on the Earth. Since the beginning of my photographic work, my photos have been decried by all adversaries as swindles, lies and deception, and this happens by enviers, know-it-alls and malicious antagonists still today after more than 30 years, while falsifications, which as a rule only show photographic dashes of color, are assessed as genuine. But well, let us leave that alone, because enough has already been said about it. Look here. Bernadette printed me this page regarding the British air traffic control. If you would like to read it, please.
Ta reads.
Very interesting that somebody from the British air traffic control makes these statements.
Are these observations of real rightness?
Such observations are not only made in England, but around the world in practically all countries, whereby, however, there is silence about it as usual. And I will say this before you ask, that all these unknown flying objects are on the one hand secret terrestrial flying apparatuses, but also on the other hand those of the future inhabitants of the Earth, and of those who are unknown to us, and with whom we maintain no contacts. Our own flying apparatuses, except in seldom cases our telemetric discs, are shielded by us from sight and radar, etc., in such a way that they cannot or only extremely seldom be seen by human beings of Earth. This, however, only if in that relation certain causal foreordinations result which are under our control. It is not possible to locate us by radar, nor by other technical means. Hence, we remain also invisible for the ones foreign to the Earth who are unknown to us, who so far obviously are unable to detect our presence here on the Earth, which also applies to the future inhabitants of the Earth.
Thank you. By certain causal foreordinations, you probably mean that such a causal foreordination takes place, if it is inherent in your will that you want to be observed, as has also been the case on various occasions with FIGU members in the last decades since 1975.
Right.
When I was in the 4th grade of primary school, and my teacher was Hans Frey, it was in 1948, your father, Svath, explained to me that altogether there are 7 major powers of nature in the universe. On the one hand, the gravity, then the electromagnetism, as well as the strong and weak nuclear power, and further the...
Stop. You are not permitted to openly name the 3 others, as indeed my father already had forbidden it to you. These 3 other powers of nature are not yet known of by the terrestrial physicists, and they are still not allowed to discover them, because premature cognitions would have severe consequences.
All right, excuse me, it remains withheld. It is certainly not in my interest to betray confided secrets, as I really only wanted to talk about the fact that there are not only the 4 natural powers known to the terrestrial physicists, rather also the remaining 3 which are still unknown to them, which exist as certain tiny and ultra-tiny particles as related to the gravity, the electromagnetism, and the strong and weak nuclear power. Also, the dark energy and the dark matter are included in the realm of particles, whereby certain of these particles, which are indeed also energies with powers, are supposed to be discovered in the foreseeable future, as you have said recently. Although it will still take a while, the success is to be understood, indeed according to your explanation, as a prediction. Additionally, I assume that I may say that these, let us say, the normal or simple elementary particles, in turn contain, in 7-fold wise, still tinier particles which, as I learnt from Schwath, can be designated as ultra-tiny, ultra-elementary particles, so to speak. Even when I, with this statement, draw attention to the fact that a fundamental 7-fold chain of natural powers exists, and that other particles exist in the already known and unknown elementary particles, and that only then, below that series of 7, that begins, wherefrom originally everything evolved from pure spirit energy, I thereby betray no secret, because all of that corresponds to the spiritual teaching, in which I indeed also mention these things openly. And since the terrestrial physicists, especially the particle physicists, lack the inner and fundamental knowledge about the actual spirit-energetical structure of these things, they anyway are not able to comprehend anything of which I speak. There would probably have to be exact statements and explanations in order for the physicists to get any benefit from it. Among the physicists, the physical cognitions in relation to the true and fundamental structure and the exact interrelationships of the material are indeed still in the material realm of the material, because they have till this day not yet become so smart that they would have arrived at the thought that the origin of all material, everything which exists in the entire universe as a whole, cannot be explained simply from the perspective of the purely material realm. Also, the elementary particles, as such, despite their energetical tininess and inconspicuousness, are also purely material and not immaterial, because the immaterial is of pure spirit-energetical nature, and that energy alone is the absolutely one and only origin of all things and all material of any kind. And thereby, belonging to the material is everything which is solid material, liquid and gaseous, which can also be perceived by the human being and measured in the most various ways and detected, as your father explained to me according to your physics. However, that which is fine fluidal and high fine fluidal consists of pure spirit energy, and this is not graspable for the human being. And alone this spirit energy is the origin of all existence of those things which can be registered, detected and measured in any manner by the human being, while up to the present time it is not yet possible, nor will it be possible for a long time into the future, for human beings to provide evidence for and measure the creational natural spirit energy. But since those terrestrial physicists who deal with the origin of life, and therefore also with the solid, liquid and gaseous material, and who attempt to explore everything in this regard, lack even the most minimal cognition regarding the spirit, energy from which everything in its absolute origin has emerged and come about, they are still very far from being able to research for and gain cognitions about how the process of coming into material being results from the purely spiritual energy. Like children who poke around in their food annoyedly and do not find in it what tastes good to them, so the terrestrial physicists poke around in an area where they cannot find the real origin of all things. Of course, it is necessary, with the research related to this, to recognize the purely material aspects of the material, and then to in the right way utilize these cognitions so as to do no harm with them. But if the real origin of all things is to be recognized, then after all the cognition must mature that it lies in the spirit energy. However, this energy has nothing to do with that which is erroneously designated as a spirit by the human beings of Earth, which as such is supposed to embody what is the human consciousness. The spirit, that is to say, the spirit energy, is not the consciousness, because the spirit, or indeed, does not think, and it creates no spiritual property, because this is reserved for the material consciousness alone. Thus, in human beings, or other life forms, also no illness of the spirit can appear, rather only a consciousness clouding and consciousness illness, and so forth, because the spirit, that is to say the spirit form, that is to say the spirit energy, is absolutely off limits and not capable of being influenced by anything whatsoever, such as diseases, etc., from the material realm.
Seen from this viewpoint, there are no objections to your statements. Erroneously, it seemed to me that you wanted to speak openly about what would have to be done regarding.
Excuse me, one can always err at times from which no one is really excluded. But your admonition that I betray nothing which could bring harm is really quite appropriate, because it could well be that someday I will blab out a secret. And I understand that with the Earthlings, especially among physicists of all kinds, too much knowledge would lead to catastrophic disaster if they could gain cognizance of certain things too early. That which has resulted from the much too early insight, with respect to the atomic physics, alone proved to a terrible degree what too early cognitions are causing, if these can be put into practice. Thus further and even worse catastrophes could happen if, Regarding particle physics, too early cognitions could be gained and thereby new and even more catastrophic weapons than the atomic bomb could be fabricated. And as Svath once explained to me, this should be absolutely possible in regard to the ultra-elementary particles, if they were misused for the purposes of destruction. But perhaps it would be good if you could also contribute your part to all that I have said. But in a simple way, please, so that all interested human beings understand what you have to say.
I will gladly do that. Set out in a simple way of speaking, a premature cognition could lead to serious consequences, as also happened with the prematurely gained cognitions pertaining to nuclear fission. Already through these alone, in relation to the terrestrial humanity, extremely malicious, dangerous, negative and catastrophic consequences resulted, but also enormous irreparable damages and destructions to the entire fauna, flora, and the climate which extend up to the present and future time. The fact that the cognitions concerning nuclear technology and its use in the form of nuclear bombs and weapons, etc., have been and are being used for the mass extermination of human beings and their insidious murder, as well as for tremendous destructions of human achievements through acts of war, with the aim of bringing death, calamity, and ruin upon earthly humankind. That fact is the catastrophic consequence of a far too early cognition concerning physical laws, their values, and their possibilities. Also to be noted are the serious consequences of nuclear power plants which, as a result of direct or indirect technical failure caused by natural powers, have irradiated very large areas for very long periods and made them uninhabitable. This, in addition to the contamination with radiation of human beings, mammals, and other creatures, which has led to countless deaths, freak births, and terrible mutations, and continues to occur. Since the earthly scientists, not only the physicists, but scientists of all stripes, are not aware of their real responsibility in relation to their research and cognitions, as has been proven over the last 4,000 years, then every new scientific cognition is life, fauna and flora, as well as humanity, endangering if it concerns something new of every kind, which can in any way whatsoever be used destructively and life-damagingly. For this reason, one must prevent that at least our highly developed and very far-reaching technical, physical, medical, biological, chemical, astronomical, etc. very comprehensive cognitions, cognizances, practices, capabilities, possibilities, and politics, etc. are not explained and not released to the human beings of Earth. Because through their irresponsibility, they would cause much greater calamity than they have done already for millennia and continue to do. In accordance with our directives, we are not even allowed to describe our advanced and far-reaching medical cognitions and practices, because the cognitions which we own of the medical science would also be irresponsibly and mercilessly abused by the Earth humans, be it for the purpose of the torture, the espionage, or in the sense that certain imperious ones and others with might would solely use it for their own benefit. This, for example, to extend their lives for many decades and even centuries, and to rule over their peoples as merciless, conscienceless, brutal, and in many respects perverted greedy for might ones. So our directives prohibit us from revealing our knowledge to such still monstrously barbaric and irresponsible human beings. And unfortunately, not only individual might-greedy ones, but the majority of humankind on Earth have perverted in such a wise that higher knowledge in the mentioned areas must not be imparted to them. In fact, in today's mass of more than 8,000 million Earth humans, only a minority is to be mentioned, which strives for real humanity and for an actual being human. And it is also only this minority that consciously strives for the evolution of consciousness with regard to the perception, recognition, and following of the creational natural laws and recommendation. The only way of help in general form is therefore that we, based on impulsations, provide a certain help regarding the development of the righteousness of humankind on Earth. so that it learns to perceive the creational natural laws and recommendations, to make them its own, and to implement them gradually in a progressive way. In the case of certain humankinds, we are therefore striving to teach inconspicuous persons by means of impulsations of the universally exactly corresponding creational natural laws and recommendations, so that they can become teaching-based active among their peoples, but without themselves having any intuition that impulsation-based tuitions are imparted to them. On worlds where larger groups of most distant descendants of the Nocodemian lineage exist, when they have reached a certain evolutive state of consciousness, wise ones are inserted among the people through whom then the tuition takes place. This is in a similar wise also the case concerning the human beings of Earth, whereby this case, however, represents a direct lineage to the Nocodemion prophethood, to which a larger number of ancient mission participants are bound, which I certainly do not have to specifically explain to you.
Of course, I do not need an explanation for this, but I like that you once openly raised the issue of why your directives prohibit an interference in the aforementioned earthly concerns. And that I keep mum, that is a matter of course, just thought that maybe one could talk about it today. Well, that happens not to be so. But what about your prediction from the year 1975, suggesting that in late summer 2012 probes will be used on Mars to find proof that courses of rivers existed on the planet's surface, whose water caused debris to be transported and abraded, just as is the case with our rivers on the Earth and also on other planets? Up to now, there has been no television or radio broadcast or any newspaper article or note whatsoever regarding such a discovery.
It will turn out that this corresponds to the rightness, but you did not have to keep quiet about it.
In that case, I had misunderstood something. Then a question about the asteroid you made me see on the evening of the 11th of August 2008, after the official contact conversation, when you flew with me on a flight far out into the outer space. You told me at that time that the asteroid, which was about 10 or 12 meters in size, would fall down on the Earth on the 6th of October, because it was on a direct course to our planet. But because I did not hear about the crash of such an asteroid at that time, and specifically still not to this day, I assume that your calculations did not correspond to the rightness, and that the asteroid had continued on its normal course and disappeared again. Can you tell me why it was possible for you to make a miscalculation of this magnitude? Your calculations are otherwise always correct down to the last detail. Did something unforeseen happen that went against your calculations?
Our calculations corresponded absolutely to the rightness, because the asteroid weighing about 82 tons, with an average size of 4.7 meters, approached the Earth with 45,000 kilometers per hour, and then penetrated the atmosphere with a speed of about 13 kilometers per second. In doing so, at 5:46 hours on the 6th of October 2008, it fragmented in a huge explosion into tiniest pieces, namely in northern Sudan at an altitude of quite exactly 37.6 kilometers above the Nubian desert.
But that must have been a huge explosion.
You can imagine a small atomic bomb explosion as a comparison.
However, why was nothing about it reported in the media?
Whether or not there was reporting about it, that I do not know.
It anyway is not so important. After all, it is simply good that the crash did not cause any damage because it exploded high above the Earth, as you say. Damage, however, is being caused by the overpopulation, and in fact ever more so because it is growing unstoppably, and therethrough, with all the trimmings of bad things that are created from it, more and more natural disasters are appearing. In this regard, you told me privately recently that, by means of the climate change caused by the humankind, the world's oceans may heat up quite enormously, and thereby the so-called global conveyor belt, which drives the waters through all the world's oceans, might break down.
This is right, because if the global conveyor belt, which, in the form of a huge stream, crosses the oceans and constantly mixes their water, breaks down, then the movements of the oceans will stand still, which then means that the majority of all life on the Earth will be extinguished. Already at the present time, things are very bad, because the world's oceans have warmed to an alarming degree. Namely, in the last 17.9 years, with a thermal energy like the one that must be calculated by 2,000 million Hiroshima atom bombs. Due to the guilt of humankind of Earth, the Earth is already today amid this destructive process, whereby the oceans and the global conveyor belt warm up more and more in increasing dangerousness.
Nevertheless, on that, all talking and warning is of no use, nor is it of any use regarding all other bad things, such as, for example, the fact that cattle, pigs, other animals, and all kinds of poultry are bred in enormous quantities in order to master the hunger for meat of the human beings. But the fact that in the process, enormous masses and tonnages of foods are planted and produced for all these beasts alone, to feed them, that fact is not brought to the attention of the world's population. Just as it is not brought forward concerning the fact that enormous quantities of plant-based foods are converted into biofuel to operate motor vehicles with it. And all this is happening by scrupulous global corporations and conscienceless farmers, etc., who only want to rake in money and get richer and richer, while millions of human beings on Earth are starving and dying of hunger. But about that too we have already talked often, which is why I would now like to discuss something with you that is quite unpleasant. So, the following has reached my ears, which then caused quite negative effects and in which I finally got involved. Thus, I want to explain the matter to you and ask you whether it would perhaps be good if we talked about it openly and not privately, because it could certainly be instructive for very many human beings. The matter is thus
As for me asking Quetzal and our committee for an advice on this, as you wish it to be, I will refrain from doing so because the whole matter is so primitive and beneath all dignity of human beings who think of themselves as adults, that it corresponds to an unparalleled shame. Not even children would behave in this wise. But it seems to be different with human beings who think of themselves as adults, in the sense that they actually conduct themselves in this shameful manner among their likes. And I advise against you officially mentioning what you have explained, because such things cast a very bad light on those who are affected by this. However, also all those who are in contact with such perverting fallible ones would therethrough end up with a bad reputation.
Your opinion is understandable to me because when I was confronted with the matter, I expressed a similar stance on it. But you know the human beings, because there are always many of them, where everything is just like talking to a wall, simply because on the one hand they are self-opinionated, and on the other hand deaf to the truth. Very many behave worse than chamberpot students, believe themselves to be the greatest and are simply unteachable. But to tell the truth, I got upset when I was confronted with it, hence I raised my voice quite loudly. But if you think that we ought not to seek advice from Quetzal and the Body Council, and discuss all this in private only, then I will abide by it.
Things would probably have been the same for me as for you, even if I have no great tendency to get loud. However, such perversions as you have explained them and which have been brought to you really require a hard and clear statement which cannot be made in a low voice.
Interesting. In all the years that I now know you, I had never noticed that you think in this wise. Although I know that you can become quite energetic, which I have also already experienced with you, but that you can also get loud according to your words, that is new to me.
In certain situations it is necessary, or it happens when the nerves are overstrained. This can also happen to me and may in general also occur with us Plejaren, whereby then, however, no perversions do appear.
Yes, I do understand that, because I can recall this from the group of you, but only on a small scale, the way I experienced it with you in former times, especially with Quetzal, when hell was still breaking loose in our group. But that what you say, that you too can react in the aforementioned wise, that only makes you all the more human.
We Plejaren are also indeed nothing else than human beings, even if, compared to Earth humans, we are far more advanced in every form of development. We are in every respect human beings and also remain human beings, at least as long as we do still have human bodies and have not yet entered the level of the High Council.
Gratifying to hear that.
But then I now do not want to miss to still express my opinion concerning the matter you asked me for. However, I do not want these words of mine to be openly mentioned either. To say more about that would certainly be too much.
I suppose it would be like carrying water into the Rhine. You are right about that. And I think with that, this topic is also concluded. Then I have a question that refers to the Neanderthals, or rather to their extinction. Again and again there are reports about it on television and in newspapers and magazines, whereby the scientists, however, to this day still do not know the real reason for their extinction. There are the most diverse gray theories about this, including one that says that the Neanderthals were exterminated by Homo sapiens, the emerging human being at the time, as you yourself once said. But is that really true down to the last detail? We both talked about it amongst other times also on the 11th of August 2008 at the 469th Contact Conversation, whereby you said the following. Excerpt from Volume 11, page 422, sentences 135, 139.
It was indeed the case that in the most various locations the modern human beings interbred with Neanderthals and begot offspring. This, however, was not the rule, but occurred rather sparsely. As a rule, the modern human beings hunted the Neanderthals and killed them, to use them as food, because the early Homo sapiens were cannibals, and as such they, by and by, wiped out the Neanderthals. Partly, the modern human beings held Neanderthals as captives, which they killed and ate in case of need for food. Such captives were also used on certain occasions to perform sexual acts with the Homo sapiens, and indeed with both sexes. As a result, also certain female Neanderthals and Homo sapiens bore hybrids as offspring, however, which was not often the case.
Additionally, I now want to ask you whether that which you have explained is comprehensive in relation to the extinction of the Neanderthals, or whether there were yet other factors which played a role. You did indeed once say later that the extinction of these early human beings led back not only to the then emergence of modern human beings, even though they exterminated different groups of Neanderthals. By the way, today the term Neanderthal is also written with a th, thus, Neanderthals. I also do not know why. But if you could now explain to me across the board some more about these early human beings and their environment, etc., as well as whether there were perhaps other reasons for their extinction besides the ones you have mentioned to me. Because for our scientists it is still not clear what the real reason for the extinction had been, so their minds are divided. Maybe you are able to bring a little more clarity to the matter.
That which I have said to you with my explanation in the 469th Contact Conversation corresponds very well to the rightness. But if you are raising the whole thing in such a way as to ask whether thereby everything has been comprehensively explained down to the last detail, then it must be said that this is not the case. In fact, the modern human beings who emerged then exterminated entire groups and tribes of Neanderthals. But for their final extinction, there were also anatomical as well as natural climate-changing influences given, which I have hitherto never mentioned and which ultimately ended the existence of these early human beings. Apart from the fact that the modern human beings came to Europe from Western Asia, who often ate human flesh and were anatomically much more developed than the Neanderthals, whom they hunted down, killed, and used them as food, there are, as I said, other important factors that led to the extinction of these early human beings. But if I am now supposed to mention other important factors, then I will gladly do so, and in doing so I will draw on our records which we possess and which I am familiar with. Thereby I will not proceed chronologically, however, rather simply as I remember the facts at the moment. So the first thing to say is that which I explained regarding modern human beings' cannibalism and in relation to the sexual acts between them and the Neanderthals, in fact, corresponds to the reality of that time. Although, against all adversity at the time, the Neanderthals held their own for a little more than 250,000 years, but in the development of their body and metabolism, they were adjusted to the then prevailing very cold climate. That finally led to their last doom because when in a short time extremely strong climatic changes occurred, the effect for the Neanderthals was an extremely disadvantageous impact on their food supply. Consequently, many began to suffer from hunger. Over time, this led not only to degenerative effects, but also often to the death. In spite of their savagery, they were sociable beings and held tightly together, whereby they lived, however, only in small groups, and their total number always remained small. When diseases arose among them, they concerned themselves collectively with the sick and nursed them. Their diet consisted primarily of meat, which they captured by corresponding hunts for all kinds of small and large animals, whereby they then shared the meat among themselves in a remarkably communal way. However, they also nourished themselves with berries, fruits, and plants, but the meat always remained the staple food, which was of great necessity for especially their entire constitution. Fundamentally, however, they were bad at metabolizing food, on which I will be speaking again. Physically, they were very strong, and also all their internal and external constitution was extremely robust and adjusted in such a way to withstand very cold temperatures, which was particularly important because they indeed lived during a very cold time. They were also clever and had their own, if still primitive, language. They led their existence in productive hunting areas in the then forests in which they also lived and knew safe shelters, in whose protection they also had their accommodations. However, all this changed unusually quickly, as around 45,000 years ago the climate began to change drastically. In addition to the fact that the modern human beings made their appearance and hunted them down, kept them prisoners, engaged in sexual relations with them, but also killed and ate them when food was in short supply. The emerging climate change gradually also altered the forests and landscapes. Consequently, gigantic open expanses emerged in which the Neanderthals could not hold their own, and as a consequence of their cumbersomeness, also could not hunt. Their specialty was the forests, where they could stalk the game to be hunted and kill it with primitive, heavy spears equipped with stone points that had been beaten into shape. These heavy killing instruments, and the ponderousness and clumsiness of the Neanderthals, made it impossible for them to hold their own in the vastness of open plains. Moreover, they could not stalk the wildlife on open land because it fled quickly if it sighted or caught the scent of the human beings. So the Neanderthals hid in the forests, which had now become lighter, but where they also had more and more difficulties in terms of hunting because they no longer had any cover due to the lightening of the forest areas when stalking the animals. Furthermore, it was the case that the Neanderthals could not sufficiently utilize the nutrients from meat, plants, berries, and fruits, and could not efficiently convert them into energy. Consequently, they had to constantly eat large quantities. The cells and their energies and powers of the early human beings were of a completely different nature than those of the much lighter and more flexibly built modern human beings. With the Neanderthals, the entire metabolism was laid out to the production of heat, which was absolutely necessary as a consequence of the then prevailing cold. This was completely different from the modern human beings who had emerged and were downright puny compared to the Neanderthals, and displayed totally different characteristics to the heavily built early human beings. And since the Neanderthals increasingly lacked food, it naturally led to many dying of hunger, while others were hunted and captured by the cannibalistic modern human beings to use them as welcome sex objects or, in an emergency, as food. Since through the sexual acts between the Neanderthals and the modern human beings, offspring were also conceived, it turned out that the offspring increasingly had the characteristics of modern human beings. Hence, this is another factor of what led to the extinction and extermination of the pure Neanderthals. And since the evolution never stands still, it turned out that the modern human beings also evolved further, up to the present Homo sapiens sapiens, whereby the heritage of the Neanderthals has been preserved in the genome of many terrestrial human beings to this day. Although the Neanderthals became extinct almost 30,000 years ago, however, their genetic heritage remains intact until today, and will also be passed on from generation to generation in the future. Regarding the descendants of Neanderthals directly, as well as those where modern humans were involved, it has nevertheless to be explained that also in this respect, factors of extinction played a role. Compared to the modern human beings, the Neanderthals featured larger skulls, which made the birth very difficult because the birth canal often could not be dilated far enough, which is why many female beings died during births or through severe life-threatening infections. Births among the Neanderthals were therefore particularly complicated and difficult and often fatal, which was also the reason why these early human beings did not proliferate extensively and only appeared in small groups. Alongside the genetic material of the Neanderthals, however, also traces of the genetic material of other close relatives have found their way into today's Earth humans living in Europe. Although there are no longer any pure Neanderthals among the approximately 8,000 million Earth humans today, their heritage is still to a greater or lesser extent contained in the genome of many Earth humans. And it is a fact, as you say, that there are many theories among earthly scientists regarding the Neanderthals, who today no longer exist in pure form for already some 30,000 years. But since their heritage is still present in small parts, namely up to 7%, in the genome of many Earth humans today, one really has to ask whether the Neanderthals have actually become extinct. Because if certain Earth humans of the present time are looked at, then one could actually assume that the Neanderthals are not yet extinct. This fact alone, of the Neanderthal heritage in the genome of many modern Earth humans, proves that these early human beings had sexual relationships with the modern human beings, from which descendants have emerged who have continued to reproduce and pass on their heritage over many generations, until the present time.
Then that is therefore also clear. Thank you. In recent weeks, I have been asked again and again about the events of the 11th of September 2001 in New York because of the terrorist attack. But there are also broadcasts on television about conspiracy theories concerning the events of the 11th of September 2001. In this connection, for example, the predominant conspiracy theory is that the US government itself instigated this catastrophe and had the CIA, etc., pack the two towers full of explosives and then have them blown up, which is why they collapsed. If you permit, I would today for once like to turn the conversation to the USA, to its former presidents as well as to the worldwide machinations and the way in which the US-American politics and behavior are conducted. Of course, super smart ones, such as certain loudmouthed journalists from certain newspapers, will then again scold along saying that you and I would politicize during our talks, and would also do so publicly once the reports of the conversations are written down and published. Unfortunately, these fools and failures, who express themselves in this malevolent and negative way and call themselves journalists, are not intelligent enough to comprehend and understand that you and I only express our free opinion on factual situations, and that we do nothing more than set forth facts and show possibilities which can arise from a deplorable state of affairs.
Of course, I will involve myself in a conversation with you in the mentioned manner, because there is a lot to say, to explain and to show us possibilities which can result from the far-reaching diverse and wrong as well as diverse forms of politics and behavior of the USA. However, if I want to explain something first in relation to the conspiracy theory, which is widespread in relation to the 11th of September 2001, and not only in the United States. It must be said that this in fact corresponds to a nonsense. Truthfully, everything arose the way the investigations by specialists and the secret services have resulted. Nevertheless, however, there were certain weak intelligence findings in relation to this Al-Qaeda crime, which were also brought to the attention of U.S. President George W. Bush, but which he completely ignored. Just as they were not taken seriously to the extent that they should have been by the few people who were responsible for it at the CIA, namely only 3 persons who vaguely knew about the findings. The ignorance on the part of Bush himself was based on sheer foolishness, on the one hand, and on the other, on the deeply rooted and only halfway conscious of confused thoughts of having a means of countering the ever-present threat of terror on a global scale should a terrorist catastrophe occur. As we were able to clarify, the vague cognitions of the 3 CIA people, 2 agents and a supervisor, were directed towards the likely possibility of a terrorist attack on the USA. Whereby, however, not a single assumption referred to the 2 towers of the WTC. The assumption was simply of a general nature. In his confused foolishness, the U.S. President G.W. Bush was unable to calculate the real danger in advance to such an extent that he would have ordered measures that take hold and also mobilize the CIA on a large scale for the purpose of making accurate investigations and taking precautionary nationwide protection measures. And such protection measures would in fact have been possible, as our probability calculations have shown, but as a result of the failure of the U.S. President and the 3 CIA people, everything turned out differently. However, this was already in 1976 noticeable like that, when my daughter Sim Yase made the respective predictions for you, and you were obliged to silence. Then Quetzal made the same predictions for you again in 1986. You probably remember it.
That is the case, yes, because I became hellishly miserable when Sim Yase made the prediction for me, that there would be around 3,000 dead. But I also felt the same way another time, when Quetzal mentioned the same event to me again in 1986 and explained what would really transpire. It is simply incomprehensible why the American people elect such zeros and fools into the government, who bring the country nothing but tremendous damage, just as it has happened again and again since ancient times. One only needs to think of the most important things and factors that brought an enormous amount of misery into the world, and that were triggered by U.S. presidents. Look here. With this fax of the 9th of August, I received this list from Germany regarding a few of the 43 U.S. presidents who stood out particularly crassly in terms of their criminal and felonious machinations. It also shows that Barack Obama is in reality only the 43rd, and not the 44th U.S. president. Because one of them, Grover Cleveland, was elected president on 2 different occasions, namely on the 4th of March 1885, and he held office until the 4th of March 1889. 4 years later, on the 4th of March 1893, he was once again elected and remained in office until the 4th of March 1897. So this man was both the 22nd as well as the 23rd U.S. president, and thereby the only one who has held 2 terms which did not directly follow each other. Consequently, Grover Cleveland cannot be described as 2 different presidents. But such inconsistencies have arisen in the USA since its establishment, just as such still arise today. But back to the criminal and felonious machinations of various U.S. presidents, such as, for example, those charged to President William McKinley, who was the real originator of the military conflict started in 1898 with Spain, which lost the war activities. McKinley created the Guantanamo exclave in Cuba, where George W. Bush then had political prisoners imprisoned and tortured from 2002 onwards, a practice that is still carried out in this penal and torture camp to this day. Ronald Reagan, a former bad actor and dim intellect, was on the payroll of the FBI as informant T-10, who, as such, continually squealed on, as communists, more than 50 fellow actors to the FBI. In 1979, President Jimmy Carter, a peanut farmer, ordered the CIA to support the Islamic guerrilla fighters in Afghanistan, where a civil war was underway, in which the Soviet Union had also involved itself. Supplies of arms were also connected with this, which, after the victory over the communist government of Afghanistan in 1992, were then used by the militias, which now fought each other, whereby subsequently the brutal and violent as well as religiously fanatical group of the Taliban emerged from this, which from then on terrorized the people. And this could only have gone so far because Jimmy Carter intervened in the Afghanistan conflict and allowed the CIA to freely operate there at will. The whole thing then simmered on for years and finally led to another Islamist organization, Al-Qaeda, which then brought about the catastrophe in New York on the 11th of September 2001. The President John F. Kennedy was no better either, because in the year 1963, he secretly enacted a law that enabled him to print vast amounts of money, of which the Treasury Department spent $4.2 million. This money, that is to say the banknotes, did not belong to the USA, but to a group of private banks which, in 1913, had merged into the Federal Reserve System Fed. The U.S. state does not have the right to print banknotes itself, because only the Fed is entitled to do so, from which the government has to borrow the money and on whose notes Federal Reserve Note is written, whereas on Kennedy's notes, United States Note is written. On the other hand, Kennedy's banknote stated United States Note. Therefore, from the Fed's point of view, Kennedy's banknotes were counterfeit money, which Lyndon B. Johnson had taken out of circulation in his first official act as Kennedy's successor, when he was assassinated in 1963. Then there was the President George Washington, who actually started the First World War with the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763, which means that 3 world wars have already taken place and not just 2. Although your father Svath already told me that, but I had completely forgotten it, so I only stumbled upon it again through this chronicle here. Well, Washington, as a military leader in the War of Independence, as a liberal thinker, was also a shrewd leader of state when the Constitution was being drafted. At the age of 22, he was still a British officer in the American colonies. He was thereby then involved in an incident that was fundamentally the cause of the real First World War, which shook the earth. With 160 soldiers in 1754, he patrolled the Ohio Valley between British and French territories. In May of that year, the French sent a diplomat to get Washington out of their territory. However, the latter ordered the firing on the diplomatic corps, where through the French negotiator and about 13 of his soldiers who went with him were deliberately murdered, with Washington's hope of driving a wedge between the French and the British, because only such a conflict between the two colonial powers could lead to the success regarding the American War of Independence. This felony led to the triggering of the so-called French and Indian War, from which, 2 years later, emerged the bloody conflicts between the great European powers and thus the 7 Years' War, which was fought in America, Europe, and Asia, and therefore was worldwide, which is why this was the real First World War, which, however, something which is however concealed from the world's population. That is why there was and is always talk of the threat of a Third World War. Consequently, if another world-encompassing war were to break out as a result of the greed for might of some irrational mightful ones of states, this would then be the Fourth World War. Over the course of the years, I had completely forgotten this, because I only remembered what Svath had told me about the First World War when I saw this chronology. President Andrew Jackson was just as criminal as Washington, and he must be held responsible for the first and so far greatest ethnic cleansing in the history of U.S. America. Criminally, he drove 100,000 Indians from their homeland, although even as a soldier he was already acting mercilessly and murderously against natives of the country, murdering many or expelling them. On the 28th of May, 1830, he signed the so-called Indian Removal Act, being the death sentence for countless more Indians, because this law allowed the relocation of the Indian tribes to create areas for their settlement by white farmers, etc. In this way, about a quarter of all deported Indians died. On the one hand, because they were murdered by the whites, or, on the other hand, because they did not survive the forced marches to the distant places of deportation or reservations and died miserably. President Franklin D. Roosevelt also made himself guilty in that he wanted and provoked the attack on Pearl Harbor. However, this was only discovered 60 years later by a former naval officer named Robert Stinnett. In relation to that, one expert said, "It took such an act to make the American nation immediately and totally turn to war." With a trade embargo, Roosevelt forced the Japanese to adopt coercive measures, which came to the fore in a counterattack against the embargo, thus the attack on Pearl Harbor, in which there were 2,403 dead and 1,178 wounded to mourn, as well as the destruction of 14 warships and 320 destroyed or severely damaged aircrafts. 90% of all U.S. Americans were initially opposed to an entry into the Second World War I. In Third World War, however, after Pearl Harbor, the people also screamed for war. By the way, Roosevelt learned of the threat of attack through the Secret Services, but he did not react to prevent anything, just as George W. Bush did not react when it came to prevent the terror catastrophe of the 11th of September 2001. Furthermore, there was President John Adams, who was a supporter of the monarchy and who would have liked to see the America of that time governed by a king, whereby he in fact also wanted to establish an American dictatorship. And so it happened that when the conflict with France broke out in 1798, he used the opportunity to enact one of the most controversial laws of U.S. America, namely the so-called Alien and Sedition Acts, which consists of 4 parts and which entitles the president to detain and deport every foreigner in the country. In addition, by attacking the first constitutional article, which guarantees the freedom of the press, he also determined that the publication of false and malicious writings against the president could be considered a punishable offense and prosecuted. This led to countless people being accused and sentenced on the basis of this law during John Adams's term in office. The only reason he was unable to realize his plans for the establishment of a dictatorship was the fact that he was not re-elected. President Thomas Jefferson, his successor, then immediately repealed and suspended 3 of the 4 parts of the law. The Alien Enemies Act, however, which allows that human beings who originate from states that were or are at war, etc., with the U.S. America can be deported, still exists even in the present time. Apart from the U.S. presidents mentioned up to now, who have caused great evil, there would be various others to be mentioned, which however would go much too far, hence I will only mention 2 more, so one being Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt. Lincoln proclaimed on the 22nd of August 1862 that his highest goal was the preservation of the Union, that is, the Union of the American Federal States, because in this union between the traditional South and the modern North, a deep rift had arisen, and so the whole thing had already been crumbling away for years. He further declared that if he could save the Union without having to free a single slave, then he would do it. This remark was precisely the opposite of why he was elected president, because he actually proclaimed the abolition of slavery in the USA. Contrary to this, however, he promised already during the election campaign in the year 1860 that he did not want to abolish the slavery, whereby the slavery should not be allowed any more in the newly emerging federal states. Consequently, the southern states rejected Lincoln as president. Thus, presidential contradiction and once again contradiction, resulting in 7 federal states leaving the Union and founding the Confederacy, which was the prelude to the American Civil War, which lasted from 1861 to 1865. The South fought for its traditional social system, while no reason for war was at hand for the North to wage war against the South. Consequently, Abraham Lincoln thought of providing a reason for war. Therefore, on the 1st of January 1863, he proclaimed the so-called Emancipation Declaration, according to which all slaves would be free with immediate effect. But this was nothing more than an evil trick to start a fight for the abolition of slavery from a political war. There, through a double weakening of the Southern Confederacy was brought about. because immediately more than 3 million Southern slaves became allies of the North, whereby many of them joined the fight against the Southern states, whereby of course many also met their death. And now, when finally the talk is of U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, it has to be said that he too is not blameless. When the USA won the Spanish-American War in 1898 and rose to become a world power, the former British colony now became a colonial power itself, whereby Guam, Cuba, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico were transferred from Spain to the USA. But since resistance against the new colonial power USA arose in the Philippines, the people defended themselves. When Theodore Roosevelt was then elected president in the USA in September 1901, it happened, when he had been in office for not even 2 weeks, that more than 50 U.S. soldiers were killed in a guerrilla attack on the Philippine island of Samar. Full of revenge and pathological craving for retaliation, Roosevelt commanded General Jacob H. Smith to solve the problem of the guerrilla war in the Philippines once and for all, in such a way that no prisoners would be taken, but that instead everyone was to be killed and burned, and in fact the more the better. This criminal command led to the so-called Philippine Balangiga massacre, in which about 50,000 human beings were tortured, killed, and massacred. However, these were not guerrilla fighters first and foremost, but civilians, old human beings, women, and children. General Jacob H. Smith was well suited for this action, because he was best known for his brutality, lack of human dignity, and as homicidal maniac, because already in the year 1890 he made a name for himself as a slaughterer and perpetrator of a massacre at the Wounded Knee Massacre, when masses of women, children, and men of the Miniconjou Lakota Sioux Indians were bestially slaughtered and massacred there by the U.S. soldiers. When the general was then put before a court-martial for this in 1902, he was acquitted at the insistence of the U.S. government, which meant that he was not held accountable for many thousands of murders. And now, once again, for the upcoming November, the majority of the population of the USA, especially the Republicans, will adore and build up such a major zero and first-rate psychopathy figure, so as to hype him up to become U.S. president. And if this Romney should take the helm, then the USA and the world can probably again expect something that will really take all the biscuits.
To that it must be said that this man, Mitt Romney, is only standing up for his own interests, because the concerns of the people and the country are anything but important to him. In the same vein, many of the former U.S. presidents did in fact act, as I have already once explained to you on a previous occasion, and also mentioned certain criminal and felonious acts of which they had made themselves guilty. And now, regarding the statements contained in this fax, I can only confirm them. With relation to the outcome of the election, it has to be said that unfortunately too many prejudiced by this man Romney financially mighty as well as simple-minded ones from the people will vote for him. But before this vote can take place in 2 months' time on the 6th of November, the election campaign will be overshadowed by an worldly, and as long as any human beings can remember, unseen hurricane which will cause enormous damage on the east coast of the USA, the likes of which have never been the case in America before. Unfortunately, due to the storm, there will also be almost 60 human lives to mourn. However, this tremendous whirlwind will only be the beginning of further such and even more devastating whirlwinds, which in the future will cause much worse destruction worldwide than those caused by the coming whirlwind at the end of the month of October. And it is a fact in this regard that the humankind of Earth has to bear the blame for this, namely as a result of the overpopulation that has arisen and is spreading further and further, by means of which enormous and severe destructive effects will be caused on the whole of nature, its cycle, and thus also on the climate. I mention this predictively because this coming serious natural event will interrupt the election campaign activities for a short time, whereby, however, Romney will then, in an imperious and irresponsible manner, immediately after the storm, seize the opportunity to make propaganda for himself again, which corresponds exactly to his psychopathic, imperious, egoistic and irresponsible nature, which should give his followers and voters something to think about. This, while Obama will exercise his presidential duty and responsibility and take care of the human beings in the catastrophe. But the result of the election will then nevertheless be that the rational American men and women will once again vote for Barack Obama, and thus prevent an election of the heavily psychopathic and also inconstant, as well as devious and dishonest Romney. If this man were to gain the might, then that whole large part of the American population which does not belong to the really rich would be very much to be pitied, because this part of the population would be tormented by Romney. The middle class would suffer very great disadvantages, and the class of the poor would fall into even deeper poverty, while various firms and corporations as well as the American state itself would be driven to ruin by this psychopathic, might-greedy, and human-hostile Romney. In foreign policy, too, a great deal of harm would be caused, and this, economically as well as through criminal military and Secret Service actions, and everything would become even worse than it was the case under the two Bush who had might.
Aha, so then this evil can be avoided through the rational ones of the USA population. But with the USA, the whole thing cannot go on forever the way it was before Barack Obama came, who was to be thanked for the end of the Iraq engagement and the elimination of Osama bin Laden, but also for the huge humanitarian progress for the American people concerning the comprehensive health insurance, which this human-hostile Romney really wants to abolish again. When I consider what you confided to me as early as 1975 on my great journey, that the superpower USA could come to an end after 2020 according to your probability calculations, if nothing changes for the better in this state until then, and if allies with the USA continue to distance themselves from this state or even become open enemies, then Obama might perhaps be the crucial point that this can still be prevented, couldn't he?
That could be the case, but one must also consider what the Obama successors will then continue to do and what domestic and foreign policy they will pursue, because this will also determine what will happen after 2020.
Back in the year 1975, you mentioned on the one hand in particular the tremendous contradictions in terms of the politics, the economy, the military machinations, the decay of the culture as well as the increasing phenomenon of religions and sects and the serious criminal acts or even felonies of the former presidents of the USA, and said that if one would continue to muddle through these things to the same and still increasing extent, then the collapse would be unavoidable. I have taken good notice of all that, and I can really understand if the result is as you have calculated. Furthermore, you also said at that time that China could then molt into the next world and superpower when the USA collapses, but that this would fundamentally require that China would rally strong allies around itself until then, because these were necessary to have sufficient influence as superpower and to be able to exist as such at all. An economic power alone, such as China would be, which would be dependent on the world economy, you explained, would not be enough to be a superpower. But megalomania could lead to catastrophic attempts and worldwide acts of war in order to achieve a superpower position. But if now, in relation to the USA, one only considers the huge national mountain of debt of more than $16 million, which can no longer be repaid, and for which the ongoing interest can only be paid barely, or not even any longer amply, then even the least intelligent one must recognize how things stand with the USA. However, US America is indeed not alone in this, because one only has to think of Germany, France, England, Spain, and Italy, etc., which are equally all around mismanaging and have mountains of debt weighing millions of millions. My home country, Switzerland, is also laid out to run up debt, even if only to the tune of more than 100,000 million, but that too is enough, and there is no one there to stop the bad actions. But to get back to the USA again, one also has to look at all the all-encompassing US mismanagement and all the other inconsistencies as well as the zeros of US presidents, whereby I, however, exclude Barack Obama, who among all the major zeros up to now drops out of the traditional role in a variety of things. Then I also see that your probability calculation could be fulfilled. Although there are certain things happening under Obama too that must not be seen as right. Whereby I am hereof thinking especially of the issue of the remote-controlled drones for the killing of terrorists and terror suspects. Yet you have explained in this connection that the whole of the corresponding body of thought and action does not originate with him, but with those who practically forced him to give his orders and signatures in accordance with their will and demand. You said that he himself would be practically mightless, even though might is officially attributed to him, and it would be held against him that he alone would be able to decide about the deadly drone missions, and in this respect would have taken the rudder directly to himself, whereby he was, is, and will also be held responsible for the most diverse military and political machinations that did not, for example, do not, correspond to his ideas. Although he is a very mighty man, he is nevertheless dependent on his advisers as well as on all those who have the might to advise him disingenuously, to influence, to direct, and to force him according to their will. These mighty ones are the highest of the military, the Department of War and Defense, the Secret Services, but as well as also politicians, consultants, confidants, banks, the stock exchange and the groups of companies dealing with machines, pharmaceuticals and armaments and the government elites and religious sectarian leaders, etc. But if I now think about your probability calculations, then it makes me all the more assuming that your calculations can come true. When I consider that you explained at that time that the USA is inflicting more and more and increasingly tremendous damage upon its allies around the world, and that as a result resistance and even hostility against US America arises, then I still want to explain, in relation to many predictions that you have made, that many have struck me very often hard, especially because I had to keep silent and was not allowed to give any warnings. Actually, I am quite happy today that you no longer make predictions, because these were always immensely burdening for me, because there was nothing I could do to prevent the events from becoming reality. Although you have allowed me to make an attempt to contact the US government via L, who was working for the CIA, however the US government via the CIA then made unfulfillable demands, which were unfulfillable according to your will, which is why no positive relationship came about. I then actually received the unfulfillable demands in writing. But this too was indeed predicted by you. Consequently, after the fruitless attempt at contact with the US government, I did no longer make any further efforts in this matter and would also not undertake such efforts again. Moreover, you also said yourselves that the attempt that was carried out would be the first and the last, and that you would therefore not allow anything further hereof. Therefore, I will abide by that. But regarding predictions, if I am particularly interested in something of the future, will you same as up to now tell me further facts, as long as I do not publish them? And what will happen if the USA collapses?
We will continue to give you information if you want us to, or if you think it might be necessary to make a prediction available to the public, whereby it must then be a question on your part and only about something very specific that no longer falls within the old scope of the predictions. And what you mention in relation to what I said regarding the U.S. President Barack Obama corresponds to the facts. Serious things are being blamed on him, which are not according to his own decision, but which he simply has to approve perforce. And much of what he wants in terms of positive changes or what he has achieved for the direct welfare benefit of poorer parts of the population is being maliciously negatively attributed to him by envious, might-greedy and rich ones, and evil means are being used to try to abolish again the good that he has achieved. However, regarding what would ensue should the USA fall into ruin, this would mean that under certain circumstances, a dictatorship and naked Gewalt one would arise, something which has already been emerging for years. The people of the USA are being put on an ever shorter leash, financially exploited, and deprived of everything from which they could benefit, something for which the rich and their hangers-on are mainly responsible, as well as those elite in government who only represent their excessive wealth, their greed for money, and their absolutely personal interests. But this corresponds exactly to the opposite of Barack Obama's ideas, who wants both good and the best for the people, but also for the state itself. And this political and government elite consists of both Republicans, but at the same time also of Democrats. Valuable reforms for the well-being of the population and the state are not in demand. Thus, the already deep-rooted poverty among the people continues to spread, while the rich enrich themselves more and more, whereby the social inequality is ever faster gaining ground. Thus, in the event of a collapse of the USA, only two possibilities can be considered, whereby the one boils down to a dictatorship with evil reprisals and great gavolt, while the other possibility can be a new rebuilding. If people with a fundamental sense of responsibility reach the government and really do everything possible to bring about an effective and valueful new beginning. However, whether this will happen is currently highly questionable, because at present everything is in a totalitarian way directed towards economic, military, political and cultural, as well as strictly fundamentalist religious sectarian interests, and towards monstrous lies and disingenuous, human contemptuous, criminal, and felonious machinations in every conceivable regard. This also means that the population of the USA is spied on by the secret services, and even in a purely neighborly manner, etc., and that their freedom is restricted in every possible way, and this in addition to the gavolt, one as it shows up openly and covertly in various forms. Also regarding China, I must stick to the statements I have made. Just like the fact that the USA are a superpower, which spread death, ruin and destruction, as well as hatred and intrigue all over the world, wherethrough the worldwide terrorism is steadily being further promoted. A terrorism which Obama is fighting according to the will of those who have forced him to do so, and are now shifting the whole might and responsibility for it onto him alone, among other things with remote-controlled, death-bringing drones. And as far as the matter with the U.S. government, the CIA and with you is concerned, the following is to be said. The fact that the attempt to establish contact will fail was due to the imperiousness of the U.S. government and the contacted CIA people to about 92% predictable. However, an 8% possibility remained open that a small success might still occur. This was especially true because agents parked themselves in the restaurant Brook and Wage in Dusnang and kept contact with L in the center. For this reason, there was little hope, and so we assumed, I must confess that. We ourselves also had certain expectations attached to this when we allowed you to try to establish contact with the government of the USA, because a small success might indeed have resulted. We therefore allowed you to make an attempt whereby, unfortunately, everything proved to be illusory. And it was really nothing more than an attempt. But we also did not want to simply pass over your insistence, so that you could recognize for yourself that such an undertaking is very difficult. But the possibility, which was only 8% open, that something positive could have been achieved, was then nevertheless not crowned with success.
Aha, then you have thereby, in a certain way, also given me a lesson, which, in this regard, was certainly good. Against your advice, however, I then tried to set up a FIGU group in the USA with interested American people, something which then, however, has also failed, namely 4 times to date. Unfortunately, it has turned out that most human beings in America do not understand what a democratic attitude actually is, and that a FIGU group can and may only persist and exist in a democratic way. All the time, the emphasis was placed on a ruling, directing and dictatorial action, but this was and is absolutely unacceptable, which is why we from the core group had to dissolve the corresponding US-American groupings again. Obviously, it does not seem to be understood that in a FIGU democracy there must be no class differences and that decisions must not be taken and executed by individual exercisers of might in a group, rather solely and only by the majority of the group members. With the democracy there are no class differences at all, because it is solely and exclusively the mass of the majority that decides. In the FIGU core group, however, we have advanced another very big step ahead, Because in our case, the level of democracy is so high that decisions are only valid if an absolute unanimity of all core group members is given. Apparently, however, in the USA, as sadly also in other states, it is not clear to the human beings what democracy actually means, and that only through it, a true community can really exist in peace, freedom, harmony, as well as in equality, equal rights, and equal value. Of course, there are many human beings in the USA, as well as in all other countries of Earth, who are interested in the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life, that is to say, the spiritual teaching, and who would like to have a FIGU group in their own country. But this can effectively only be possible if such a group is handled and led in conformity with the FIGU democracy. I would also wish the same for the United States. Even if you are not pleased with the ununderstanding on the part of the majority of the human beings of America with regard to their understanding of freedom, peace, harmony, and democracy. However, the human beings in the USA too are able to learn, and indeed it is a considerable number who are interested in the teaching and who also strive to respect the mission and the teaching, to life-based behave in conformity with the FIGU rules and the creational natural laws and recommendations, and to get an accordingly intended grouping on its feet. This, however, is unfortunately not easy, because many personal and also fellow human beings and governmental authorities' difficulties have to be overcome, whereby the personal problems are probably the greatest and most extensive, and this especially with regard to one's own correct behavior towards fellow human beings, and the acceptance of a comprehensively democratic attitude and leadership of a FIGU grouping.
Your opinion does you honor, but you have yours and we have ours, whereby ours has so far proved true. However, we would be happy to be surprised and taught something that might become feasible if the human beings in the USA who are interested in the teaching and mission will after all be able to free themselves from their wrong views, opinions, and behaviors, etc., and will be able to integrate themselves with the rules of FIGU.
A small number of persons are really trying hard to form a good FIGU grouping in the USA, so there are really good people over there who are trying very hard. If I thereby just think of Michael Horn, who has already worked so many years for the teaching and the mission, then he and his work cannot be valued highly enough. After all, not all human beings need to act to his indefatigable extent, because even a lesser effort is already very valuable, and such an effort can be accomplished by many in America. Admittedly, these are only a minority, but if these engage themselves, then much can be achieved through them. Even a small number of human beings can achieve much and bring about a change for the better and good in many others if they make an effort. As the saying goes, constant dripping wears the stone. Looked at in this sense, everything that is loveless, evil, unpeaceful, disharmonious, false and unfree, as well as any Gewalt, one imperiousness and addiction to might, any hatred, any revenge, and any addiction to retribution can be worn away to the bottom, as can everything that is dictatorial and harming the body and the life.
There is nothing there with which to argue because your words correspond to the reality. But that does not change anything about our stance. Should something change for the better, for the good, and for the right with regard to the human beings and the behavior of the American persons, then we too will change our opinion. However, we are very pleased with the already for many years ongoing efforts of Michael Horn, whereby he has achieved unusual accomplishments, the value of which is impossible to estimate. Although we also acknowledge the efforts of all those persons in the USA who for decades strove for the formation of a FIGU group and also in terms of learning with regard to the spiritual teaching. They have nevertheless unfortunately not achieved what they claim to want to achieve.
However, something that is not yet the case can still turn out to be. But it has to be said, and you know this too, that from my part, for several years already, no more efforts have been made in the USA with regard to a FIGU group formation. The contact to a still loose group, which, after the dissolution of the Florida FIGU group by the core group, has newly formed and at least for the time being, cannot yet be called an official FIGU group, is only kept up by Philia and Christian, Time will tell what will result from this group one day. What arose with the FIGU Japan Landesgruppe is known to you. That the core group also had to dissolve this one too, because the group leadership there also had the audacity to place itself hierarchically and in exercising might over the members. A transitional group is now forming there, which must be officially regulated according to Japanese law. And in this respect, I think that now, for this new FIGU group in Japan, persons have been elected who are of integrity and who get things right. That is to be hoped. Thereby it is also good that we have Kunio Uchida with us, who in certain matters and moments can make telephone contact in his mother tongue for our KG concerns regarding the new Japan group. Mrs. Strasser Kono is still responsible for the written matters concerning translations in Japanese, whereby Simone and Stefan conduct the correspondence with the people in Japan through her in accordance with the KG decisions.
All that is known to me and very well regulated by the members of the core group.
The core group members thank you for your bouquet of flowers. But now one more question regarding the earlier predictions. Certainly, as in the case concerning the US government, you knew from the very beginning that all the predictions and probability calculations made by you and me would remain unheard and unheeded like a screaming in the desert and would not produce an echo.
We knew that is right. But due to your constant insistence, we agreed and made it our duty for decades to carry out fathoming for predictions. We furthermore thought that we might be mistaken in our calculations of probability and that we could nevertheless have some effect on the human beings of Earth with the predictions and calculations. Namely, that they would prick up their ears and at least change or even prevent certain serious things. However, all of our hopes were a grave wrong assumption, to which we had fallen prey, because the majority of the human beings of Earth are so narrow-minded and imperious that they only rely on their own unintellect, on their own irrationality and illogicality, and therefore disregard all warnings and good advice. In truth, there are only minorities in all countries of the Earth who know how to make profound use of their intellect, their rationality and their logic, and who are willing to turn themselves to the reality and its truth, and also to learn, to understand, and to implement the creational natural laws and recommendations.
You are once again speaking entirely according to my thinking and with words, as I also formulate them.
Also, at my age, I can still learn a lot. Thus also your so-fitting style of explaining, talking, presenting, and speaking. All this is so apposite that I am making it more and more my own, because you are not only a very dear and valuable friend to me, but also a teacher, the likes of which I have not yet met in my lifetime.
You make me feel embarrassed, my friend. I would rather like you to explain to me in more detail why for quite some time now there have been enormous changes in the Oort cloud, which is located at the outermost edge of the SOL system, as you explained to me during a conversation on my major trip in 1975, when you gave me the opportunity to see the dark star. During one of our last conversations, you also privately hinted again something concerning the changes taking place in the Oort cloud. You said that due to the dark planet that is spooking around out there, changes are taking place that will affect the whole SOL system. To my knowledge, the earthly scientists suspect something along these lines, that the dark star exists out there, but for them, everything is still based on pure assumption. To my knowledge, they use the name Nemesis for the dark star they suspect. However, the whole matter has nothing to do with the dark planet, which moves its course on the other side of the sun, and which cannot be noticed from the Earth and wanders like a ghost through the system. Because I think that this one has nothing to do with the dark star Nemesis, does it?
That is right. The Sol system is a binary star system whereby the Sol twin is a so-called dark star, as you say. Its size is about 10 times smaller than the SOL itself, whereby this twin also has an own planet orbiting around it, as you have known since 1975. The radius of the dark star to the SOL comprises more than 1 light year. That is to say more than 9.5 million kilometers, and the orbiting of the Sol mass center, that is to say the Sol's very own orbit, amounts to about 26 million years.
Sol's own orbit, what does that mean? I don't understand this.
The sun, that is to say, Sol, does not stand still in the outer space, but rather it rotates, namely also in its own far-reaching circle around an imaginary midpoint.
Aha, I did not know that. And why haven't the earthly astronomers discovered the dark star yet?
For this purpose, the technical astronomical apparatus and devices that have existed until now are not yet suitable. But it is only a matter of time until a corresponding discovery is made. However, the currently given technical facilities are not yet capable of capturing the extremely faint light of the dark star with its satellite. And concerning the changes caused in the Oort cloud by the dark star, they are based in the fact that in the innumerable and existent in thousands of millions of smallest, small, large, and largest rock, ice and metal fragment formations, a tremendous movement takes place, and that partly large formations are hurled as meteors out of the Oort cloud into orbits of the inner Sol system. A major chain of such meteors has already been on its way to the inner Sol system for many decades, and has partly also already passed the Earth or exploded high in the Earth's atmosphere. This happens because the dark star penetrated directly into the sphere of action of the Oort cloud a long time ago and has been causing severe disturbances ever since.
Then maybe new and still unknown comets and meteors can reach from there into the inner solar system and into the range of the Earth, as it is also the case with objects from the asteroid belt. And while I am already on this subject, then I ask myself whether it is also the case with these projectiles from the Oort cloud that some circle around each other in 2s and 3s, or that some are circled around by small satellites like moons, as is the case with larger asteroids, as I was allowed to observe it in 1975 on my great trip out of your large spaceship. But what happened to that very long chain of dark meteorites that was on course to Earth from the Oort cloud, about which you reported to me privately at the beginning of 2001? Are these meteors still on their way to the inner Sol system and to the Earth?
It really was and is a really very long chain of meteors which was catapulted out of the Oort cloud and which found its way into the inner solar system and thus also to the Earth. Some of the larger meteors of this very long chain, as I have just explained, have already passed the Earth at close or further distance. Smaller ones have crashed or have exploded at high altitude above the Earth, and this over a number of years, because they were and still are so widely spread on their trajectory. The first meteor exploded towards the end of July in 2001 high above India over the Kerala area, a region you well know. Another meteor from the same chain exploded again at high altitude over India, namely in the year 2007, while the next two meteors from the respective chain penetrated the Earth's atmosphere high above Colombia and New Mexico in the year 2008 and exploded. And from this very elongated chain of meteors, there are still further ones on their way and on course to Sol and Earth, which, like the already mentioned meteors, were catapulted out of the Oort cloud by the dark star, that is to say, the dark twin of Sol. There are also still 4 forms that which belong to the category of comets and are also on a course into the inner Sol system.
So then this meteor chain is still very long, and depending on the speed of the objects, it might well still take years and decades until the last of these space satellites come into the further or closer range of the Earth, if I have understood you right. And besides those from this chain of meteors that have exploded above the Earth, are there perhaps others from the same chain that have passed by the Earth?
That is the case, yes, but I already said that, and it happened several times during the last decades. And it will also continue to be so, as a result of which quite some things will still arise on the Earth.
Not really pleasant? Then there is still a lot to be reckoned with on the Earth, because it is indeed inevitable that such meteors and comets will also penetrate the habitable zone. That is the green zone, or so-called Goldilocks zone of the solar system, in which indeed the Earth is located. On this point, then, also right away the question concerning the prophetically announced red meteor. Does this one also originate from the Oort cloud?
That is in fact right, and unless something special arises, that its orbit changes through some unexpectedly emerging factors, or that it is altered by the human beings of Earth, then it will come to pass that the prophecies will be fulfilled.
Understood. If a large object, a large comet, meteorite, or asteroid crashes onto the Earth, as it did more than 240 million years ago, where through indeed on the one hand the dinosaurs only came into existence, and these were then exterminated again about 65 million years ago. Then there are of course worldwide catastrophes, through which practically all life is extinguished. But if now a projectile that large falls from the outer space into the ocean, then it is not necessarily leading to a worldwide catastrophe. Or is it?
In fact, in this case, the destruction does not extend over the entire world, but the whole thing is then confined centrally.
How is this to be understood?
This means that when a large comet, meteorite, or asteroid crashes into the ocean, as it happened, for example, millions of years ago in the Gulf of Mexico, etc., then a gigantic tsunami arises, the area of destruction of which encompasses a certain central expanse that extends over thousands of square kilometers. Everything that is thereby directly destroyed by the actual tsunami we call central destruction area. That which is still only indirectly caused as destruction, and thus only as a further effect by the tsunami end portions, we designate as off-central.
Aha, understood. You say that millions of years ago a projectile from outer space crashed down in the Gulf of Mexico and a gigantic tsunami arose. What should I think of as gigantic, and was there a crater on the ocean floor?
In fact, a large crater has formed, which was also discovered years ago during investigations for oil drillings. And as for the giganticness of the tsunami resulting from the crash, our calculations have established that the towering masses of water must have amounted to 4,936 meters in height and must have destroyed thousands of square kilometers of land and killed innumerable living creatures.
Really gigantic. But something else. Independent life has indeed developed on the Earth, just as however comets and meteors from the outer space have brought life to the Earth. At least that's what I was taught by your father Svath, as well as by your daughter Simyase, and also by Quetzal and yourself. This life was of course very tiny, just only in the form of microorganisms. These microorganisms, that is to say microbes, are mostly unicellular living creatures, which can only be made visible by microscopic magnification due to their tininess in the range of only a few micrometers. To this now the question, whether such microorganisms are still being brought to the Earth from the outer space and indeed by comets and meteors, perhaps also by asteroids. Svath told me with regard to comets that from these microorganisms only reach the Earth when the comets crashed down to the Earth, or when the comets passed by very close to it, or when the planet got caught in their tail. Only thereby the microbes could then enter the atmosphere and the geosphere. And if I remember correctly, the earthly scientists call such microorganisms from the outer space panspermia. At least that is what I once read somewhere. But there are actually different microbes. It interests me. Are you able to say something about them?
There are, if I want to use the terrestrial scientific terms, eukaryotic microorganisms which have a genuine cell nucleus and also DNA, microalgae, microscopically small fungi, protozoa. In addition, there are the prokaryotic microorganisms that have no genuine cell nucleus, archaebacteria, cyanobacteria, and eubacteria. Then there is, however, still a third form which may well have cells, but for which a DNA is not characteristic, and which nevertheless can replicate at several hundred degrees heat. But I should not say any more about it, because these things are still unknown to the terrestrial scientists. Moreover, they are not endemic to the Earth, but rather only enter the Earth's atmosphere and geosphere temporarily via comets and meteors, that is to say, through their disintegration.
Disintegration. What do I need to understand by this? Perhaps a dissolution or some such, as for example with a comet's tail, or by way of an explosion of a comet or meteorite in or above the terrestrial atmosphere. Disintegration indeed actually means as much as splitting or exactly dissolving.
What you say is right, of course.
So I was dead lucky and did not disgrace myself. I would have been really embarrassed if I had gotten off track with my interpretation. Then again, a question, namely concerning transfats. Svat, your father, already taught me at a young age that I should always nourish myself in the right way, and should thereby take care to avoid so-called transfats. The avoidance of such fats would be important in relation to the general health, but also in terms of a balanced behavior. Because trans fats, he explained, would cause aggressive forms of behavior and constantly increase them, namely to a degree that would be stronger than alcohol. Furthermore, trans fats, that is to say, trans fatty acids, would cause pathological changes in the arteries and arteriosclerosis as well as allergies, Alzheimer's, diabetes, and cancer, but also pathological inflammations, etc., and would further advance everything if such things were already present. However, recently people like a certain Brigitte Nussbaum, a Professor Josef Kriegelstein, and a Professor Dr. Suzanne Klump, deceased in 2009, claim that olive oil would be able to contribute to arteriosclerosis. Studies at the Institute for Pharmaceutical and Medicinal Chemistry at the University of Munster are said to lead to the conclusion that monounsaturated fatty acids are supposed to have adverse health effects. Are you able to say something enlightening about this?
What my father taught you is absolutely right, whereas the claim that unsaturated fatty acids are supposed to have harmful effects on health is false. It is trans fatty acids that are extremely harmful to health and dangerous to the entire organism, especially also because they lead to obesity and also to depression, make ill, as well as very often create diabetes, arteriosclerosis, and cancer. Unfortunately, however, the human beings of Earth are not conscious of this, which is why they conscientiously consume trans fats and thus endanger their health and even their lives. Trans fatty acids are as bad and damaging to health and endangering life as dioxins, which arise during combustion processes and form very toxic compounds, especially of chlorine and hydrocarbons, which cause serious damage to health and development. The trans fatty acids are vernacularly simply called trans fats, whereby, however, the fewest human beings of Earth in the general population are aware that these are extremely damaging to health forms of fat. It is thereby especially carrying weight that the normal population does not know any details about this, which makes the whole matter particularly dangerous. It is therefore also for this fact that there is a very great danger, especially for the growing children and young persons, because especially parts of the terrestrial humankind consume the largest amounts of trans fats with food, which often cause irreparable damage to health. The trans fatty acids, it is of course them, are extremely dangerous, because the body can only break down their transfigured hydrocarbon double bonds with extreme difficulty or not at all. For this reason, the physical organic health is put under extraordinary strain, whereby also obesity develops and the harmful LDL cholesterol levels rise high and cause arteriosclerosis, that is to say, arterial plaque. This, however, means that thereby the risk of myocardial infarction and stroke increases sharply. Like no other fat, already small amounts of trans fats are very dangerous, whereby as little as 2.5 grams per day increase the risk of the aforementioned ailments, health defects, and affective illnesses by more than 30% if they are regularly consumed in the mentioned quantities over a period of 4 to 8 years. Therefore, if trans fats are consumed daily, this will over time inevitably lead to grave health problems, and this especially if the human being is genetically predisposed to early arteriosclerosis. Already for decades, the human beings of Earth have been consuming excessive amounts of trans fats, in particular through fast food products. Through many ready-made products, biscuits, bakery products, croissants, chicken nuggets, cakes, French fries, croquettes, various chips and burgers, popcorn, various curd products, as well as through other fat-containing products, that is to say, fatty foods. Hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated vegetable fat contains trans fats.
What fats and oils are available on the earth that should be used specifically?
Fundamentally and primarily, only high-quality vegetable oils that are rich in mono- and polyunsaturated fatty acids should be used. Very good among these are olive oil, rapeseed oil, safflower oil, sunflower oil, corn germ oil, almond oil, sesame oil, walnut oil, hazelnut oil, evening primrose oil, borage oil, wheat germ oil, and peanut oil, because these oils reduce to a large extent the negative influence of trans fatty acids in many prepared foods, that is to say, meals. When preparing foods and meals, very strict attention should be paid to ensuring that they contain as much as possible only healthy fats and oils with mono- and polyunsaturated fatty acids. Particularly important in this respect are, for example, omega-3 fatty acids, which can especially be found in fish oils from salmon, trout, herring, tuna, and mackerel, although they can also be found in krill oil as well as in the oils of various olives, in rapeseed, in nuts, in the hemp and in linseed, etc. But it is in that regard important that all these oils be cold-pressed. Otherwise, they will become as good as worthless in terms of the mono- or polyunsaturatedness of the fatty acids. As regards the omega-3 fatty acids, the factors EPA and DHA are also of major importance because, in the context of a balanced diet, they make a significant contribution in relation to a good health, whereby these substances also exert a valuable influence on the blood regulation. In addition, DHA is a very important component for the function of the photoreceptor cells, as well as for the impulse-conducting membranes of the brain. For the concentration, the memory, the ability to learn, and the support of mental performance. Omega-3 fatty acids are also important for the healing of inflammatory processes, which not rarely trigger chronic diseases and thus cause long-term suffering. Omega-3 fatty acids must be taken in with food because the human organism cannot produce them itself.
And what about the much-vaunted margarine and the linoleic acid?
For a long time, margarine was not harmless on the earth. But this has changed for the better over the last 2 decades, with the result that at the present time, only a few trans fats are still contained in normal margarine. Nevertheless, however, a dietetic margarine should rather be used because it contains, as a rule, many good fats. Conjugated linoleic acids are only found in milk, dairy products, and meat from ruminants. They have the characteristic of lowering the cholesterol level and preventing arteriosclerosis, whereby they also strengthen the immune system and furthermore support the buildup of muscle tissue and the formation of bones. Because of their many valuable constituent parts, milk and dairy products belong in the healthy diet. Whereby, however, for those human beings who suffer from an intolerance to milk and dairy products, special considerations apply which are to be followed. Note Billy = worked out according to explanations from a specialized journal. Attention! TA's explanation only applies to human beings who are not suffering from a lactose intolerance or an allergy to milk, that is to say, an allergy to cow's milk proteins. Lactose intolerance is not harmless and must be taken seriously. The lactose intolerance is an adverse reaction to lactose, whereby this reaction occurs if the small intestine produces too little of the digestive enzyme lactase. Fortunately, also, not every human being who suffers from lactose intolerance suffers to the same extent from this intolerability to milk sugar. However, for human beings who do suffer from lactose intolerance, there are by all means possibilities for them to have a balanced diet without having to give up milk and dairy products. And therefore, lactose intolerance does not mean that one must actually do without and entirely without milk. Milk contains milk sugar, namely lactose, whereby it is given for about 20% of the European population that they are lactose intolerant, and milk sugar is difficult for them to digest. If these human beings nevertheless enjoy milk, typical symptoms of lactose intolerance occur, which manifest themselves through various ailments, such as abdominal pain, flatulence, or diarrhea, etc., whereby, however, severe health-impairing suffering can also be caused. Of course, the tolerance limit when drinking milk can vary greatly from one human being to another, as is the case in relation to the digestive ailments. For the sake of understanding, it must be said that a lactose intolerance, that is to say, milk sugar intolerability, has nothing to do with a milk allergy, which is actually of a different nature and is based on an allergy to cow's milk protein. Consequently, attention must be paid to ensure that these two different factors are not confused. A milk allergy is founded on a reaction of the immune system, which reacts negatively to certain parts of the protein in cow's milk. Of course, there are also milk-based foods that are free of lactose, such as the following varieties of cheese: Emmental, Gruyere, and Sprinkles. On the internet and in nutritional publications, a large number of foods that are lactose-free can be found. Milk and milk products contain very valuable nutrients and belong, for the majority of human beings, to the most important basic foods. However, those affected by lactose intolerance do not need to amply do without these nutrient suppliers, because they can still resort to milk and dairy products if they observe their personal tolerance level, whether they contain little or no lactose.
How can one tell, for example, when buying food, whether a product contains many trans fatty acids?
If a product contains a lot of fat and has a long shelf life, this is, as a rule, a sign that many trans fatty acids are contained in it.
The HDL cholesterol is thus good and protects the arteries from the harmful LDL cholesterol. This LDL cholesterol is therefore increasingly depositing itself in the blood vessels and so leads to calcification of the arteries, that is to say, arteriosclerosis. And if this one is fostered at an early stage, then the risk of heart attack and stroke increases with it.
It can also greatly impair the health of pregnant women, lead to miscarriages and stillbirths, as well as damages to the baby's health. Fundamentally, however, it is particularly all those human beings who are prone to arteriosclerosis who are at risk. Furthermore, however, also human beings who have a high risk of cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, and allergies, etc.
You also mentioned the children.
Right, because in their case there is a particularly great danger for them to, due to a wrong diet, namely especially because of partially or fully saturated fatty acids, fall prey to obesity and also get impaired in terms of consciousness-based concentration. They become overweight and also have problems with the consciousness-based concentration. One example, 5 to 6-year-old child should not ingest more than 1.5 grams of trans fatty acids daily. But if this child eats a piece of bread with a little margarine for breakfast and a quark turnover in the morning, then fries at lunchtime and consumes after that a donut, and eats half a box of chocolate biscuits in the afternoon and ready-made vanilla pudding in the evening, then he or she is already taking in the insane amount of 6.5 grams of trans fatty acids.
What is actually meant by partially or fully hydrogenated fats, that is to say trans fats?
The fats are artificially put into the state of so-called solidification. Putting it in other words, this means that fats are artificially cured, whereby the fats are obtained through a chemical intervention from vegetable and fish oil. Fundamentally, the fatty acids that occur in the food can, in accordance with their chemical structure, be divided into the two groups saturated and unsaturated fatty acids. The chemically treated and therefore saturated fatty acids can be classified into short, medium, and long chains, while the unsaturated fatty acids are referred to as mono or polyunsaturated ones.
And why are they cured? I do not understand, when in fact the cured trans fats are so harmful to health.
The matter is quite simply that because of the so-called solidification of fats, the corresponding foods have a much longer shelf life and do not become rancid. Moreover, trans fatty acids are cheap, which is of great profitable benefit to the manufacturer. However, for the human beings who eat these trans fats, the entire matter is very bad, because of all the fats, these are the ones that cause the most damage to the health of human beings. But there are also trans fatty acids in nature, as for example in ruminants, as for example in the fat of cattle, in which the trans fatty acids are formed by bacteria in the rumen. Furthermore, calves as well as sheep and goats, etc., are from a biochemical perspective natural producers of trans fatty acids, whereby these trans fatty acids are of a completely different nature and are absolutely harmless to health.
However, Svath, your father, said that both saturated and unsaturated fatty acids from plants and animals were necessary for the nutrition of the human being. Thus, both saturated and unsaturated fatty acids are through all ways present in our food. Thereby he also talked about the butter and lactic acid, which would be very valuable, as long as the human being would be able to produce the necessary enzymes for these foods.
That is correct. But with high-fat foods and their consumption, a healthy amount is always a prerequisite. Admittedly, both saturated and unsaturated vegetable and animal fatty acids have their justification in a healthy diet. In animal products, the milk fat is unique, because it features an unusually rich spectrum of very valuable fatty acids, which is why its composition is ideal for the human being, whereby however, the tolerability must be taken into account because with certain human beings, the necessary corresponding enzyme production is missing, which makes milk and milk products digestible for them. If this enzyme production is deficient, then milk and dairy products are not recommendable and, under certain circumstances, very harmful to health.
And which fats can actually be labeled as healthier? Are they vegetable or animal ones?
Vegetable fats are the most valuable because they contain more unsaturated fatty acids, while animal fats show more saturated ones. The origin of the fats is therefore the decisive factor, whereby, however, all dietary fats contain saturated and unsaturated fatty acids. The most valuable fats are the natural ones contained in butter and in cold-pressed vegetable oils such as in rapeseed and nuts.
It is often claimed that milk and dairy products in general would be harmful, therefore also the lactic acids.
For many human beings, children and adults' milk and dairy products are more or less harmful to health, but this cannot be generalized. The harmfulness only applies to human beings whose enzyme production is more or less deficient or even completely absent with regard to the digestibility of milk and dairy products.
We have already been talking about the fact that milk and dairy products, especially from cows, are harmful, but you have not provided any further explanation about this. There was also a conversation with Quetzal about this once. So things look a bit different if the enzyme production that is necessary for the digestion is missing or lacking.
Yes, we have talked about that, but it was already quite some time ago. In fact, however, the production of enzymes in relation to the tolerability of milk and dairy products was at that occasion not addressed. See 216th Contact Conversation of the 16th of March, 1987, Sentence 127, 217th Contact Conversation of the 8th of May, 1987, from Sentence 30. 301st Contact Conversation of the 24th of April 2001 from Sentence 60. 326th Contact Conversation of the 15th of April 2002 from Sentence 56. 447th Contact Conversation of the 20th of April 2007 from Sentence 38.
That only vegetable fats would be healthy, as these in particular contain many unsaturated fatty acids, is therefore not entirely true.
That is really not true. So, for example, coconut and palm fats, despite being of vegetable origin, contain the most saturated fatty acids of all dietary fats. Vegetable fats can therefore not simply be considered healthy because among them there are also various saturated fats.
But the milk fat contains many healthy fatty acids, hence it is healthy. What are all the places where it is present?
Especially the milk fat that is found in milk and butter, as well as in cheese and other dairy products, is a very special fat, because in its composition it neither resembles vegetable oils nor animal fats. Altogether, milk fat contains practically all saturated, unsaturated, short, medium, and long-chain fatty acids. In total, they are more than 400 different types of fatty acids, something that no other food can show. With this rich variety of fatty acids, milk fat is ideally tailored to human needs. Some fatty acids show particularly positive effects with regard to the health. Thus, for example, the short-chain butyric acid, which occurs almost exclusively in milk fat, has a major cancer-inhibiting effect, whereby particularly the risk of colon and breast cancer is reduced. Milk fat also presents no risk of cholesterol. On the contrary, it lowers the risk of heart attacks. The effects of saturated fatty acids from milk fat on cholesterol levels vary greatly, whereby, however, viewed as a whole, they do not cause an increase in cholesterol levels.
Thank you for your important explanations. That should actually be enough and clarify everything. But what I am now really interested in, with your help, I was indeed able to twice see a Yeti in the Himalayan region, which were around 3 meters tall and were most distant descendants of tall great apes, whose most distant ancestors largely died out 60 to 75 million years ago as a result of the effects of the Tobo supervolcano eruption in Sumatra, I was told. I do no longer know the designation for these giant apes, which you, however, can certainly tell me again. But what interests me is whether the legendary Bigfoot in America, the Sasquatch in Canada, and the similar creatures spotted in the south of the USA are also most distant descendants of the giant great apes?
This is indeed the case, because both in northern India, Pakistan, Tibet, and in the north and south of the USA, small populations of the hominid Gigantopithecus giganteus, as they are called in earthly paleontology, survived. During the time between 7 and 9 million years ago, natural disasters occurred through which once again a decimation of these human-like ape creatures took place, just as it, however, also did about 100,000 years ago. Then, a mere 75,000 years ago, the supervolcano Tobo erupted in Sumatra and created a worldwide climate catastrophe and radical climate change, through which over the course of more than 10 years many species of life forms died out. The genus Gigantopithecus giganteus was decimated too, yet smaller populations of the actual giant apes survived in various places, as did, however, also some few subspecies. And from these few populations, some extremely small and very isolated groups have persisted to the present day, which live in the areas you mentioned. To these human-like and upright ape creatures which still exist today and really only the very smallest isolated groups belong the so-called Yeti, Bigfoot, and Sasquatch.
Thank you. Then this is also for once clearly told. And as I have been able to see such creatures twice with your help, I can also say that these extraordinarily hairy creatures look really human being and ape-like and have nothing to do with big bears, as the Austrian mountaineer Reinhold Messner claims loudmouthedly to the contrary.
That man is very full of himself, gives himself airs, and believes himself to be bigger and more important than he really is.
Boom. But look here. I have copied this from the 543rd contact conversation on the 4th of August 2012. But what can actually be said about the fructose, which is so much praised in terms of being so good for losing body weight? Regarding my body weight, it is as you have predicted that it does indeed not continue to decrease, but always hovers around 80 kilograms, even though I consume food on a back burner. Should I perhaps pay attention that when I eat sweet dishes, I only take those that contain fructose, instead of white granulated sugar? Would that eventually reduce my weight somewhat further?
You are misinformed. Fructose is not suitable for losing body weight because it causes an even faster and more extensive weight gain than refined white sugar. The claim that fructose would have less influence on an increase in relation to body weight corresponds to an irrationality.
I see. That is unpleasant. Hence, a lot of nonsense is being told in this context. Regarding that, I have still one question. Because you mentioned later after this conversation also that there would be still more to mention regarding the harmfulness of the fructose, as well as of the other forms of sugar. Can you please one more time tell something about this?
Of course. Fructose not only promotes weight gain up to obesity, but also high blood pressure, heart disease, and even cancer, as well as diabetes. In this regard, it has to be said that the insulin is responsible for it, because it stimulates the cells to absorb a lot of sugar, wherethrough then various cancer sufferings are triggered. However, this also means that types of sugar other than fructose are in the same way harmful, whereby, however, this occurs especially when the consumption of sugar is pathological, such as with regard to the consumption of sweets and overly sugary drinks, which as a rule leads to physical adiposity as well as to the becoming fatty of the liver, as a result of which it can then no longer work fully effectively. Fundamentally, however, it is also the case that due to the fructose and all other types of sugar, when too much of it is consumed, molecular restructuring takes place in the brain. However, this is on the one hand dependent on the type and quantity of the sugar, but on the other hand also on the metabolism, etc. of the human being.
I have understood that, but that thingy, the physical adiposity or whatever you said, that I do not understand, what is that? I have never heard the word before, but it still seems familiar to me, perhaps from Latin?
Adiposity is the Latin medical term for obesity.
Aha, got it. Thanks for the instruction.
It got late, so I have to leave again.
Yes, it is really late.
Then I want to say goodbye until mid or end of November or until December. Farewell and see you again, dear friend.
Farewell, Tupta, my friend, until another time again.